It was the most haunting curse in French history, delivered not with venomous words or bitter malice, but with the cold precision of a dying woman's breath. Catherine de Medici, the notorious Queen Mother, uttered those words as she lay on her deathbed, surrounded by the echoes of a life filled with power, treachery, and blood. She had seen the downfall of kings, the rise of ruthless men, and the crushing weight of her own ambition. But it was one final act of vengeance, one last curse that would see her legacy fulfilled in the most horrifying way imaginable. This curse, this final declaration, would not fade into the shadows of history. No, it would take root in the bones of the French court, in the heart of her bloodline, and in the very fabric of the nation she had once ruled. Before we unravel this terrifying story, hit that like button and subscribe because you won't want to miss what comes next. In this video, we delve into the cursed final days of Catherine de Medici and how her death sparked an eerie chain of events that led to one of the darkest chapters in French history. Catherine de Medici, on her deathbed, was said to have uttered a curse that would live on long after her passing. This wasn't the curse of a desperate woman clinging to power. It was a chilling prophecy, one that would entangle her family for generations. In this section, we will explore the brutal nature of Catherine's life, the ruthless political maneuvering, the bloody intrigues, and the tragic consequences of her unrelenting ambition. But more than that, we will begin to piece together how her final words would become more than just a legend. They would become the haunting truth of her family's demise. In the aftermath of Catherine's death, her descendants would find themselves ensnared by forces far darker than any of the political scheming she had once manipulated. The curse, whether real or symbolic, took on a life of its own. Wars, betrayals, and untimely deaths followed swiftly. Her children, once destined for greatness, would be cast into the depths of power struggles and bloody revolutions. And as each of them succumbed to untimely ends, the legend of Catherine's curse would grow, until it became inextricably tied to the fate of her bloodline and the very fabric of French royalty itself. Before Catherine, a woman whose life had been defined by ruthless ambition and a deep understanding of power, lay frail and nearing death. The grand halls of the French court, once filled with the sounds of scheming and plotting, had fallen silent as the Queen Mother breathed her last. Her body was weak, but her mind was sharp until the very end. As she lay in her bed, the shadows of the past crept into the room, her mind, fractured by years of tragedy, no longer able to carry the weight of her decisions alone. It is said that in those final moments, with her family gathered around her, Catherine uttered a curse so chilling it would reverberate through generations. "May my bloodline be damned to the same fate that I have wrought upon so many," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but enough to carry the weight of a life spent weaving tragedy and manipulation. Her words, a mixture of grief, regret, and perhaps a final bitter triumph, would seal the fate of her children and her legacy. Catherine's life had been one of unrelenting ambition. Born into the powerful Medici family, she had been married off to Henry, the future King of France, when she was just 14. A pawn in a game of dynastic politics, she soon learned how to navigate the treacherous waters of the French court.
From the very beginning, Catherine was forced to endure humiliation, rejection, and the constant threat of betrayal. Her marriage to Henry was loveless, and for years, her enemies saw her as little more than a weak foreigner, unworthy of the crown. But Catherine was no fool. She knew that survival in the court required more than mere beauty or charm. It demanded control, cunning, and the willingness to make any sacrifice, no matter how brutal. As Queen Mother, She had orchestrated the bloodiest events in French history. She was the mastermind behind the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in cold blood. This was the price of power in Catherine's world. Brutality and manipulation were not just tools, they were the very foundation upon which her reign had been built. But as her final moments approached, Catherine's mind seemed to turn inward. The years of betrayal, cruelty, and political machinations had taken their toll. She saw the weight of her actions, the countless lives destroyed by her ambition, and perhaps it was then that she realized the price of power was never truly paid in gold, but in blood. Her family had been her greatest weapon, but they had also been her greatest weakness. She had raised her children in a world where power was everything, and mercy was a luxury only the weak could afford. Her sons, Henry III, Charles IX, and Francis II, were caught in the whirlwind of her schemes, each of them haunted by the specter of their mother's influence. The curse, if it were a curse at all, was not merely a product of Catherine's dying breath. It was the inevitable consequence of a life spent manipulating those closest to her, weaving a web of power so complex that it could never escape its own grasp. As the Queen Mother's life ebbed away, the court around her began to stir. The scent of incense and candle smoke filled the room, mixing with the sharp, sterile air of impending death. But Catherine's mind was far from this place, far from the opulence of the court. She saw visions of her sons, her legacy, and the horrors she had set in motion. Her last breath came not as a quiet release, but as the final act in a play of tragedy she had written for her bloodline. In the days that followed, the court would turn its eyes to her children, to the inheritance she had left them. But the curse would not be immediately evident. It would slither through the cracks of their lives, creeping into the shadows of their ambitions and desires. The men and women who had once feared and adored Catherine would look to her sons to continue her work, not realizing that they too would be swept up in the chaos she had set in motion. Her death was not just the passing of a queen, but the beginning of something darker. The curse, woven into the very fabric of her bloodline, would unravel in ways no one could predict. The House of Medici, once a symbol of unassailable power, would be brought to its knees, one tragic loss at a time. In the aftermath of Catherine de Medici's death, the tremors of her final curse began to ripple through the halls of the French court. Her children, each destined for greatness or ruin, soon found themselves locked in a struggle far beyond what even her mother had endured. The family that had once seemed unstoppable, with Catherine at its helm, now seemed to crumble under the weight of its own bloodshed, as if the curse had woven itself into every decision, every plot, every betrayal. Her son, Charles IX, ascended to the throne in 1560, still a young and impressionable king. It was not long before the echoes of her mother's influence began to shape his reign. The legacy of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a massacre she had instigated, was still fresh in the minds of the people. Thousands of Huguenots, Protestants who had sought refuge in Paris, were slaughtered by the king's orders, an event that would forever stain Charles's reign. Many saw the massacre as a result of his mother's iron grip on the throne, her unseen hand manipulating events even from beyond the grave. It was as if Catherine's blood ran through Charles's veins, pushing him toward decisions that seemed dictated by something darker than personal will.
But it wasn't just the weight of his mother's legacy that crushed Charles. His own conscience, already fragile, began to break under the stress of his rule. The king, a man already prone to bouts of illness and paranoia, was haunted by the consequences of his actions. His guilt over the massacre grew, festering in the pit of his stomach, eating at him day and night. Rumors swirled that he saw the spirits of those he had ordered to be slaughtered, their faces twisted in torment, following him through the corridors of his palace. As he became more and more unstable, the kingdom teetered on the brink of collapse. In this time of weakness, Charles was faced with the pressures of a nation in turmoil. The French wars of religion raged on, the Protestant Huguenots and Catholic royalists clashing in battles that would shape the country for generations. His mother's advice still lingered in his mind, but Catherine's death had robbed him of her steadying presence. He was alone, adrift in a sea of conspiracies and rebellion, a puppet of forces he could neither control nor understand. Catherine's eldest son, Francis II, had not fared much better. His reign was tragically short, only lasting from 1559 to 1560, cut short by illness at the tender age of 16. Many historians believed his early death was a product of the immense pressure placed on him by his mother, as well as the relentless intrigue at the French court. In his brief time as king, Francis struggled to assert his authority over the powerful factions within his own court, most notably the Guises, a powerful family that had a grip on the young king's reign. Catherine, ever the master manipulator, had attempted to use the Guises to her advantage, but her son's premature death left the family in a state of disarray. What had been an intricate political dance of alliances and betrayals now became a dangerous free-for-all. As the curse began to tighten its grip on Catherine's surviving children, the fate of her youngest son, Henry III, became equally tragic. Ascending to the throne after Charles IX's untimely death in 1774, Henry III struggled with the same demons that had plagued his brothers. He was a king caught between the demands of the Catholic League, a powerful faction that sought to restore the power of the Catholic monarchy, and the Protestant forces that continued to challenge his rule. His reign was marked by indecision, weakness, and the fear of betrayal from every side. But perhaps the most striking part of Henry III's reign was his end, an end that seemed almost fated. In 1589, Henry was assassinated by a monk named Jacques Clément, a fanatic who saw the king's tolerance of Protestantism as a threat to the Catholic cause. The monk's dagger struck deep, delivering a mortal blow to the king's fragile reign. The death of Henry III was not just the death of a king, but the end of the Valois dynasty, a family that had once ruled France with iron authority. It was as though Catherine's final words, her curse, had followed each of her sons to their graves, each of them falling to the very forces of power and betrayal that she had once manipulated so skillfully. And so the curse that had haunted Catherine's family from the moment of her death came to fruition in the most tragic of ways. The Medici bloodline, once one of the most powerful families in Europe, was now a shadow of its former self. The House of Valois, like the Medici, was decimated by the same treachery and violence that had been woven into the very fabric of its power. As each son fell, so did the strength of their line. France, too, was left in disarray, a nation torn apart by religious conflict and civil war, its future uncertain. But even as the blood of the Medici became synonymous with tragedy, their legacy did not vanish. The name Catherine de Medici would endure, not just as the queen mother who cursed her children, but as a symbol of the darkness that lay at the heart of power. Her final curse was not just the end of her family, but the manifestation of the brutal reality of monarchy itself, a world where loyalty was fleeting, betrayal was constant, and death was the ultimate price for power. As history remembers her, Catherine de Medici is not just a woman who shaped the fate of kings, but a woman whose actions brought about the destruction of her own legacy. The curse she uttered in her final moments would live on not just in the tragic deaths of her sons, but in the story of a nation torn asunder by the very forces she had set in motion.
As time wore on, the legend of Catherine de Medici grew, not just as a queen mother, but but as a symbol of the harsh, unforgiving world of European monarchy. Her family's tragic downfall, with its layers of betrayal, war, and death, became a cautionary tale, one that echoed across the centuries. But more than a story of royal tragedy, Catherine's curse became something more, a dark myth embedded deep within the psyche of the French people. Her bloodline, once a beacon of power, now represented the dangers of ambition unchecked, the inevitable price of power purchased with blood and treachery. Though Catherine de Medici's death in 1589 marked the end of her reign over the court of France, the repercussions of her life were far from over. Her influence rippled across history, shaping the future of the monarchy in ways no one could have anticipated. The blood of the Medici, once a symbol of wealth and art, now seemed inextricably linked to ruin. The downfall of the Valois dynasty, marked by her son's tragic fates, was not just a result of external conflict, but an embodiment of the internal rot that power, unchecked and without mercy, breeds in every ruling house. For centuries, historians, novelists, and poets have revisited Catherine's life and the legend of her curse. To this day, her name remains synonymous with political intrigue, power struggles, and bloodshed. But as we look back, it's clear that Catherine was not just a woman caught in the violent tides of history. She was the architect of her own destruction, the mastermind of a kingdom that was destined to crumble under its own weight. And as tragic as it may seem, her curse, spoken in the final moments of her life, was not merely a vengeful whisper. It was the bitter truth of the cost of her ambitions. Even the tragedies of her bloodline cannot escape this legacy. The downfall of the House of Valois was a warning, a living proof that no dynasty, no matter how mighty, can survive forever when it is built on deceit and brutality. It wasn't the enemies that brought down Catherine's family. It was the very forces of power, greed, and betrayal that Catherine herself had so long wielded. The cycle of her family's rise and fall was the cycle of monarchy itself, a deadly, unrelenting force that devours those who seek to control it. Catherine de Medici's curse is not just a historical tale, it is a profound reflection on the dangers of unchecked ambition. Her final words, spoken with the weight of a lifetime of ruthless decisions, remind us that power, no matter how carefully crafted, is fragile. It is a force that can consume both the rulers and the ruled, leaving only devastation in its wake. Her legacy is a stark reminder that the human cost of absolute power is often too great to bear, and the very nature of monarchy, built on manipulation and control, can only end in ruin. The truth of Catherine's curse, whether supernatural or symbolic, lies in the fall of her dynasty. The specter of her ambition, her blood, and her power lingers long after her death. And in the tragic fates of her sons, we see that no one, not even the most cunning and calculating monarchs, can escape the inevitable fate that awaits those who build their reign on the suffering of others. In the end, Catherine de Medici's curse was not simply a prophecy, it was a warning. A reminder that power can only be wielded for so long before it consumes its wielder. And as her bloodline fell into ruin, so did the kingdom she had once ruled. The ghosts of Catherine's ambition still haunt the halls of French history, a shadow that will never fully fade. Her name lives on, not just as a queen mother, but as a symbol of the tragic cost of power and the haunting reality of her final, fatal words.